Hello class, this is Dr. Anderson, and this will be a recording of the slides that I'll show in class on cellular neurophysiology. Here we see a diagram from your textbook, and I'm hoping that we can, let's get a little pen here. So this is a cartoon right here in this particular diagram, and you see the dendrites, the little processes that bring information into the cell body. You see the cell body in this particular area. This is where the nucleus, where lots of mitochondria, lots of Golgi apparatus, a lot of cellular material, cellular machinery for making neurotransmitters. This is the initial segment of the axon. This is where the action potential is going to start. And then you have information being transmitted down the axon to the axon terminals where the neurotransmitter is released. This, in figure B, is an actual neuron in which dye has been injected. So here's the dendrite bringing information to the cell body. Here's your cell body right here. And trigger zone is perhaps in this area. It's hard to say. But we also see some branching. So this could be a dendrite. It could be an axon. It's hard to say. Clearly, this is the axon here. And then we have branching at the axon terminus. There we go. This is another picture from your textbook showing some of those organelles. So we have a dendrite, we have some mitochondria, we have some Golgi apparatus right here, some little vesicles of neurotransmitter. Then they hop a ride on a little escalator system. So these are microtubules, and these are molecules that we call molecular motors. So you have a secretory vesicle, and this little molecular motor can carry the neurotransmitter down to the axon terminus. Why is that important? It's important because if a vesicle were to diffuse all the way along the axon, that would take way too much time. It's beyond the diffusion distance. So we have a fast transport down the axon. The synaptic vesicles dock in the axon terminus and get ready for release. Now, this also bears mentioning. There's a little bit of a clinical application. There's an important protein called tau. Let's see if I can just write it here. Tau is a cytoskeleton protein, and when tau gets all messed up, we get some tangles in these microtubules in the cytoskeleton. And neurofibrillary tangles is a sign of Alzheimer's disease. There are a lot of other things going on in the cellular level with Alzheimer's, but that's one of the hallmarks, is those neurofibrillary tangles. That's basically the cytoskeleton getting all messed up. All right, so when we talk about neurons, what we really want to get into are the functions of neurons. So neurons are very important for electrical communication. So we need to start at the beginning. And at the beginning is that neurons are cells that have a membrane potential. And what the heck does that mean? Well, a membrane potential starts out as a charge separation. So here's a positive ion, here's a negative ion. You spread them apart, and there's a force that wants to bring the two particles together. They attract one another. And the interesting thing is that when you bring in a cell, there's a little membrane here. And I'm not drawn so well with my my tool here. But there's a little membrane here, and this membrane has the ability to separate this charge across the membrane. So you have this lipid bilayer here, and this lipid bilayer is very thin, you know, a few nanometers. So then you have the separation of these two charges, and this is a powerful force across this membrane. So if you have a lot more charges, you have a big force. But if the two ions are very close together, you have a big force. And that's what we have with a membrane. If you have a little teeny tiny membrane, you actually don't have to have very many charges being separated in order to generate a very big force, a source of potential energy with which the neurons can signal. So here we see a cell. I'm trying to get my little pointer back. Here we see our cell. And this shows a charge separation right here at the membrane. Out in the extracellular fluid, we have lots of negative and positive charges. You see them all out here, all over the place. Inside the cell, we have positive and negative charges. But the charge separation is something that happens only at the membrane. Only at the membrane. I'm getting weird lines from my little pointer here. Technically, if you add up all the charges inside the cell, it should sum to 0. If you sum up all the charges in the extracellular fluid, it should add up to 0. However, if you notice in this cell, there are positive charges on the outside of the cell. There are negative charges on the inside of the cell. This is a separation that occurs only at the membrane. Overall, the intracellular fluid is neutral. The extracellular fluid is neutral. And the way this cell is aligned, the inner face of the membrane is relatively negative. The outer face of the membrane is relatively positive. We have a charge separation across the membrane, and that shows the presence of a membrane potential. So where does the membrane potential come about? In short, I will just say you have a neuron with a very high permeability for potassium to leak through potassium channels. As potassium leaks out of the cell, it leaves behind a relatively negative charge. Now, why can't a negative charge leak out following the potassium? That is because the negative charges tend to be associated with proteins, and the proteins are too large to leak out. You could ask another question. As potassium is leaking out, why doesn't sodium leak in? Well, a little tiny bit of it does. But the number of leak channels, or the ability of potassium to leak out, is much greater than the ability of sodium to leak in. So the higher permeability of potassium means the outward leak of potassium is greater than the inward leak of sodium, and therefore, as potassium leaks out, it generates a relatively negative membrane potential. Now, if we compare the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid, we have a lot of differences in composition. You can see that in this particular table. You can see that there's more sodium in the outside extracellular fluid than inside the cell. You can see that there's more potassium inside the cell than outside in the extracellular fluid. Most of your chloride is outside the cell. Most of your bicarb is outside the cell. Your anions inside the cell, and as I said before, these tend to be proteins that are negatively charged. Notice our cations, and this is calcium, for the most part. Much more outside. We also have to take into account that not all this is free calcium. Some of the calcium is bound to proteins. Now, at the bottom, though, you add up all of your anions and cations inside the cell. It adds up to 0. This is called the principle of electroneutrality. It's very important. Membrane potentials only happening at the membrane. It's not a general characteristic of the intracellular fluid. Again, we add up all the anions and cations. Outside the cell, we come up with 0. The principle of electroneutrality is fulfilled, and we don't have a general charge over the entire membrane. So in this particular picture, this is from Chapter 6 in your textbook. I'm trying to find, oh, there's my pointer. So here's a little cell at rest. Another word for rest is called the polarized condition, where the inner face is relatively negative, the outer face is relatively positive. If we take a little electrode and we impale the cell, and then we have a circuit, we have a measuring electrode, we're connected to a voltmeter. Do you see how the voltmeter is pointing towards negative, saying we have a negative potential? If the outside of our cell is our reference and we're holding that to 0, the inside of the cell is relatively negative as compared to that. And if we were to make a measurement at the point of getting the electrode into the cell, we measure a resting membrane potential of minus 70 millivolts. Now this is a convention. We set the outside of the cell to 0, so the outside is our reference electrode, and then relatively speaking, the intracellular fluid has a negative resting membrane potential. Remember, this is because potassium leaks out of the cell, leaving behind a negative charge at the membrane. Sodium cannot leak in enough to counter it, and the anions inside the cell are on big proteins that are not able to leak out. So how is the resting membrane potential maintained? I've mentioned it a couple of times. Can you think to yourself how that happens? Well, the resting membrane potential is generated by the potassium leak. But the thing is, if potassium kept leaking out and kept leaking out, and we allowed sodium to leak in, we wouldn't be able to maintain that. So how do we maintain the resting membrane potential? We have a sodium-potassium pump, or an ATPase. Almost there. Whoops. There's our P. So, whoops, it's not a P. There we are. So, that's maintaining the gradients that permit potassium to leak out and generate that resting membrane potential. Now I ask, do you think the membrane is at rest very much? Let's stop and think about that. A particular neuron, and maybe I'll just go back to our original picture here. We have a neuron that's got all these dendrites, and we have lots and lots of inputs impinging on all these dendrites and all the cell bodies. And they're releasing neurotransmitter and causing all kinds of events. So if this is constantly receiving input, it's constantly getting depolarized and hyperpolarized. So actually, the membrane is not at rest very much. So what determines what the membrane potential is at any given time? Well, what determines it are channels. What are the channels that are open, and how many of them are open? So if you have a lot of potassium channels open, potassium leaks out, the membrane potential will tend to be negative. If you have a lot of sodium channels open, then sodium can come in and the membrane potential will be relatively positive. I have a couple of ways to describe this coming up, and hopefully by the time we get through this, the answer to this question will make a lot of sense to you. We have gradients across the membrane potential, or across the membrane. To use those gradients, you have to open up channels. And the membrane potential you have depends on what kind of channels are open and how many of them are open. Which brings us to a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful equation called the Goldman-Hodgkins-Katz equation. And look at all the things in the equation. We have the membrane potential, not the resting membrane potential, but the membrane potential at any given time. And we have some constants, the gas constant, the temperature, the valence of the ion, and the Faraday constant. Now, what do we need all these things for? Well, when you got a constant, basically constants help you go from one kind of unit to the other. We're talking about permeabilities, and we're talking about concentrations, and we're talking about charge, which means that when we talk about ions and their charge and their concentration, we're going to talk about joules and coulombs. And what we want is a membrane potential in volts or millivolts. And these constants simply get us from coulombs and joules and moles and all those other things to millivolts. That's what constants are. So I don't expect you to memorize these constants. You'll see how we will use these constants moving forward. All right, so we have some constants to help us get our units right. Then we have the natural log of a permeability constant times the concentration of potassium outside the cell. And a permeability constant for sodium plus a sodium concentration outside the cell. And a permeability constant for chloride times chloride concentration inside the cell. Wait a minute. Potassium's out, sodium's out, but chloride is in. What's that about? Well, chloride has a different valence than these two, which when you do a bunch of mathematics makes chloride on the top. Nothing to freak out about. On the bottom of our ratio, again, permeability constant for potassium, potassium inside the cell. Permeability constant for sodium, sodium inside the cell. Permeability constant for chloride, chloride outside the cell. So if you take your typical walking, talking neuron and you put in all these numbers, you come up with a resting membrane potential of about minus 70 millivolts. Now, who cares? No, and before I go to the next page, just notice that this is the natural log, the log of base E. We can get out of base E to log base 10 by multiplying by 2.303. Then we have valences for our various ions. And if we put all this in, then for sodium and potassium and chloride, this turns out to be 61. And we deal with the fact that chloride has a different valence by putting chloride on the top. I'll talk about this more in class if you have concerns about this. But this just tells you how you come up with a particular number. All right. Now, we saw this, we see, so, so we see this big equation, we say, oh my God, this is a big scary equation. What does Dr. A want us to actually know about this? Well, here it is. The basic meaning of the equation is that the greater the concentration difference of a particular ion, which means the gradient across the membrane, and the greater its membrane permeability, the greater will be its role in determining the membrane potential. So let's go back and look at our equation. So we have some constants, but we have permeability times concentration. So concentration out over concentration in as weighted by a permeability. Concentration out over concentration in as weighted by a permeability. Concentration in over concentration out as weighted by a permeability. So basically, the ions that have the biggest concentration gradient and the largest permeability have the most influence over the membrane potential. You could have a cell that's really, really permeable to an ion, but if there is no gradient, you won't have a lot of ion movement and you won't have a lot of influence on the membrane potential. Or you could have a huge gradient, but if you don't have very many channels and there's no way for ions to move, it's not going to have much of an influence on the membrane potential. So let's go back. The basic meaning of the Goldman-Hodgkin's-Katz equation is that the greater the concentration difference of a particular ion across a membrane and the greater its membrane permeability, the greater will be its role in determining the membrane potential. All right, so let's stop a minute and think about what learning objectives we have just covered. So you ought to be able to either sit down and write or describe to a study partner the environment around the membrane when the neurons are polarized and depolarized. So think about what some of the things we talked about. There's a high concentration of sodium outside the cell. There's a high concentration of potassium inside the cell. And then there are differing permeabilities such that at rest, the inside of the membrane is relatively negative, the outside of the cell we set to a standard. Concentration and electrical gradients. So I talked mostly about the concentration gradients. Electrical gradients have to do with charge. So let's go back a little bit here. If I have more sodium outside my cell than I have sodium inside the cell, the gradient, the concentration gradient for sodium is out to in. If at rest, the inside of the membrane is relatively negative and sodium has a positive charge, then the electrical gradient is also from out to in. Let's do another one. If most of my chloride is outside the cell, then my electrical gradient for chloride is out to in. However, if the inside of my cell is relatively negative and my chloride has a negative charge, then my electrical gradient is in to out. So notice in the case of sodium, both gradients are inward. In the case of chloride, the concentration gradient is inward, but the electrical gradient is outward. We'll talk about this in class, but you ought to be able to go through all of these on your own and figure out the directions of concentration and electrical gradients. What's the mechanism by which a negative resting membrane potential is generated and how is it maintained? You ought to be able to answer that question and summarize the concept behind the Goldman-Hodgkin's-Katz equation. So notice I'm not going to ask you to calculate something with the Goldman-Hodgkin's-Katz. I want you to know what the equation tells you and what it means. Okay, let's keep going. What if a cell is theoretically only permeable to one ion? I say theoretically because cells are permeable to lots of things and their permeability is changing. And it's really not not a real life situation where a neuron would be permeable to only one ion. But let's just say it is only permeable to one ion. And we see that theoretical scenario in this diagram. So we have a compartment that's 150 millimolar sodium chloride, 150 millimolar potassium chloride in the other compartment. So we have two compartments separated by a membrane. This is a membrane. And we introduce a permeability to only potassium. Potassium moves from, I'm trying to find my, there it is. Potassium moves from compartment 2 to compartment 1 along its concentration gradient. Notice what happens as it does. A little negative charge is left behind. Potassium moves further along its concentration gradient and more negative charge is left behind. Potassium keeps moving until more negative charges left behind, and you start to see we now have two gradients. We have the concentration gradient going towards compartment 1, and we have an electrical gradient starting to go towards compartment 2. And when you get to the point where the concentration gradient for potassium in one direction is equal and opposite to the electrical gradient for potassium in the other direction, we reach the equilibrium potential for potassium. And typically that's about minus 90 millivolts. We might, and depending on what your numbers are, we'd calculate it as minus 94 millivolts, something like that. Okay? We can do the same thing for sodium. So, under what conditions can you measure an equilibrium potential? Well, you have to have only sodium channels open. Only sodium channels. And when that happens, sodium moves from compartment 1 to compartment 2 along its concentration gradient. And as it moves, a negative charge is left behind. So compartment 2 develops a positive membrane potential. More sodium leaks towards compartment 2, and you see more of a charge separation. And as in the other case, so much sodium leaks to compartment 2 that the concentration gradient for sodium to go to compartment 2 is equal and opposite to the electrical gradient for sodium to go to compartment 1. So then sodium is at its equilibrium potential, which is about positive 60, somewhere in that neighborhood. So at rest, why is the resting membrane potential closer to the equilibrium potential of potassium, which was minus 90, than to the equilibrium potential for sodium, which is positive 60? Well, the reason is, at rest, neurons are more permeable to potassium. At rest, the major permeability is determined by a kind of channel called a leak channel, a channel that's open all the time. And neurons tend to have more potassium leak channels than they do sodium leak channels. So because the membrane is more permeable to potassium, potassium has more influence over the resting membrane potential, and the resting membrane potential is closer to the potassium equilibrium potential. And can you see that that is consistent with what we talked about in terms of the Goldman-Hodgkins-Katz equation, which says the greater the concentration difference and the greater the permeability, the greater will be its role in determining the membrane potential. Sodium has a really big concentration gradient. Potassium has a really big concentration gradient. But potassium has more influence at rest because its permeability is greater. So we can use something called the Nernst equation. The Nernst equation actually can be derived from the Goldman-Hodgkin's cats. And I'll show you that in class, but essentially, if potassium permeability is really high and chloride and sodium permeability are really low, we can sort of get rid of the sodium and the chloride variables, and the equation becomes much more simple. So the equilibrium potential of potassium is equal to 61. Now where did 61 come from? 61 came from right here. You put all these constants in and you assume a valence of +1, your constant is 61. Is 61 times the log base 10 of potassium out over potassium in. So if I use the numbers 4 over 140 from my little table, I come up with an equilibrium potential of -94. If I have a neuron and it's only permeable to potassium, potassium will leak out until the membrane potential reaches -94. Then it will reach an equilibrium where potassium is just as likely to leak in along an electrical gradient as it is to leak out along a concentration gradient. And you see I've calculated others as well. Here's the equilibrium potential for sodium, though I forgot to put my little E in here. Equilibrium potential of sodium. 61 times the log of sodium out or sodium in. So 144 out over 14 in gives me an equilibrium potential of +61. If my neuron is only permeable to sodium, sodium leaks in until the inside is so positive, sodium can't leak in anymore. So that the inward electrical gradient is equal and opposite to the outward. I think I just misspoke. I'm afraid I just misspoke. The inward concentration gradient is equal and opposite to the outward electrical gradient. All right, here's chloride. Notice my constant is -61. Why is that? Because chloride is a negative ion. I make the same calculation, 108 out over 4 in, and I come up with -87. So the equilibrium potential of chloride is pretty close to the membrane potential too, even though its permeability is not that high, which means if you open chloride channels, the membrane potential is either going to be stabilized or might hyperpolarize a little bit if you start at -70, say. Now we calculate it for calcium. Calcium is so interesting. First of all, the constant is 30. Why is that? Because you have to divide it by 2. The valence of calcium is 2. And look at this huge concentration difference. 0.5 over 10 to the -4. There's like, 10,000 fold difference. Really, really high calcium outside versus calcium inside. So when you calculate that, boy, oh boy, we have a really, really, really positive membrane potential. That means if you open up a calcium channel, calcium is going to really want to come in and depolarize the membrane. And think about that if that's not working for you after viewing this presentation. We'll be sure to discuss it in class. So I will give you an equilibrium potential to calculate. It could be sodium, it could be potassium, it could be chloride, it could be calcium. And I need you to be able to calculate those things. I would have to give you the concentrations, but I would expect you to know the formula. I would expect you to know which constant to use. All right, now chloride. Chloride is what we call passively distributed. There are some leak channels to chloride. There are ligand-gated chloride channels, but we don't really have pumps for chloride, and we don't have voltage-gated channels for chloride. So what does it mean for chloride to be passively distributed? Well, if you have a cell and you depolarize it, chloride will come in and make the membrane potential negative again. If you have a cell and you hyperpolarize it a little bit, potassium will leave and make the membrane potential polarized again. So chloride moves in and out depending on the membrane potential. And the more permeable your cell is to chloride, the more chloride has the ability to stabilize the membrane potential. We're going to find this is way more important in skeletal muscle cells than in neurons. But this idea of chloride being a passively distributed ion is an important learning objective. All right, now we have a couple of terms I want to deal with, and one of those terms is permeability, and the other term is conductance. All right, now conductance is actually having ions go through a membrane. And I alluded to this earlier talking about the Goldman-Hodgkin's cats. First of all, you need a gradient for ions to flow. If you don't have a gradient, there's nothing for the ions to flow along. However, you also need permeability. If you have a gradient but no way for ions to cross the membrane, you will not have conductance. If you have high permeability but no gradient, you will not have conductance. So to actually have ions flowing across a membrane, you have to have a gradient for the ions to travel along, and you have to have a channel for the ions to go through. And both of these things are required. I'm just making a little scribble here, sorry. Both of those things are required for there to be conductance. I also could say that ion channels are kind of weird in that, let's see if I can draw one. Let's say this is a channel, and this is my, my membrane here and here. We talk about channels being conductors because we can have an ion that travels through the channel. However, the ion's got to find the channel, it's got to bounce around in there, it's got to get through. So channels actually can conduct current, but they're also a resistor for current. So they're sort of reciprocals for each other. And maybe thinking about the blood system is something that could help you get your head around that. Blood vessels conduct blood, but blood vessels also exert resistance towards that blood flow. Channels do the very same thing relative to ion flow. Alrighty, so here we have a cell, and we see at rest, this membrane potential is -70. Notice our concentration gradient and our electrical gradient for sodium are both in. Notice that the concentration gradient for potassium is outward, and the electrical gradient for potassium is inward. So these two gradients are not in the same direction. These two gradients are in the same direction. And here's this number line that does a very nice job of explaining a question that I asked a little while ago. Why is the membrane potential closer to the equilibrium potential of potassium? And notice in this case they say it's -89. -89, -90, -94, it's all the same in the same ballpark. And here's the equilibrium potential for sodium, which here they say is 60. Rest is closer to the equilibrium potential of potassium. And why is that? Because at rest, neurons are more permeable to potassium than they are to sodium. This also tells us what would happen if we opened more sodium channels. If we increase sodium permeability, sodium would come in the cell and make the membrane potential more positive. An increase in sodium permeability would allow us to travel along this number line in that direction. All right, now, you have a membrane potential and you have channels. And when you have channels that are open and a gradient across the membrane potential, you can get conductance. And when you can get conductance, the membrane will depolarize, get less negative, or hyperpolarize, get more negative. And we're going to first talk about situations where that depolarization, or could be hyperpolarization, is passive, where you basically have the diffusion of ions. So here's a picture from your textbook, 615, and here you have a channel, and it's open, and it conducts sodium. So we have an open channel, and we have a gradient, and so sodium comes in the cell and causes an area of depolarization. Notice that doesn't just sit there, that it actually travels along the membrane. But what happens is that depolarization decays as it goes, and we see that in our second diagram. So here's the point of the channel. Here's the point of stimulation. The channel opens and we get a depolarization. And as that depolarization travels along the membrane, it decays and it gets smaller and smaller. Now, we can calculate how far we expect that depolarization to travel. We would calculate something called a space constant. And you biophysical types you might do that in a neuroscience class or in a biophysics class. We're not going to do that. But just realize there are mathematical principles that will influence how far that depolarization will travel. We also could look at a membrane in a particular spot and look at it over time. And so you could look at a particular spot at the point of depolarization and then a few milliseconds afterwards. And you'll find that the size of the potential has decayed, and how it will decay over time is dictated mathematically by something called a time constant. But decay is the important word I want you to take away from this slide. When you depolarize something or hyperpolarize something, it will travel a short distance and decay. So passive depolarizations, passive hyperpolarizations are short-lived, they're transient, and they don't go very far. So we use a number of words. We can say these depolarizations are graded because they're going to change size, they're going to change magnitude over time. We could say these depolarizations are local because they don't go very far. And that's all under this umbrella of a passive depolarization or passive current flow. So local potentials, your textbook calls them graded potentials, and here's some examples. So they vary in magnitude. They could be a positive, a depolarization, or a hyperpolarization. They decay over time, and they decay over a distance. Those are the characteristics of local graded potentials and happening by local current flow. So here's a graph. Here we're starting out at rest at minus 70 millivolts. We get a stimulus and a little bit of a depolarization. Notice it decays over time. We also could have a hyperpolarization where the stimulus causes positive ions to leave or causes negative ions to go into the cell. And we get a hyperpolarization. It also decays. In our second diagram, here we start at rest, and if we have a weak stimulus, we get a little bit of a depolarization, and if we have a strong stimulus, we get a much bigger depolarization. This is the idea that local potentials can be graded. They can be big or small, depending on the size of the stimulus. And in our third tracing, we get to the idea that these local potentials decay. So we measure the stimulus at the site where it's stimulated, and then you go 1 millimolar down the axon or down the dendrite or whatever part of the cell it is, and you see the stimulus is decayed. It's smaller than it was at the site of stimulation. And how long the distance is before the thing decays is that thing that's dictated by the space constant, the thing we're not going to get into. But if you're interested in that, you'll probably learn about that in other courses. So, very important. These are the characteristics of local current flow or graded potentials. They can vary in magnitude. They could be a depolarization or a hyperpolarization. They're not going to stay there forever. They're going to be transient and decay over time. They're going to travel a little tiny distance, and they're going to decay as they travel. Now, why? What happens to the current? Well, you see, if this is an axon and I've got a membrane, I've got all kinds of leak channels. So I have the site of a depolarization, and some of that current is going to go down the axon. Some of it is going to go through the membrane. And as it does, it decays so that I get to a spot further along the membrane, and the current is smaller than it was. That's a passive current flow, but you have to realize that when you get some kind of depolarization or hyperpolarization, the thing's going to travel, but it's going to travel in a passive way. So this is a good place to stop and think about our learning objectives. Can you define an equilibrium potential? Can you talk about the conditions under which you would measure an equilibrium potential? What kind of values do you expect for the equilibrium potentials, these 4 values? What do you mean? What does it mean in terms of changing permeability and how that would affect a neuron? Can you calculate these things? Why is chloride passively distributed, and what's the consequence of that? What's the difference between conductance and permeability? How can an ion channel be a resistor and a conductor? And what kind of properties do we associate with local current flow? You ought to be able to take a piece of paper and write down the answers to these kinds of things. Okay, now, I've been using these terms. If you start out at rest and the membrane potential becomes less negative, we talk about depolarizing. Now, Vander has another term if you get above 0, but this is you still depolarize. If you start at a depolarized value and then you come back to rest, that's called repolarizing. And if you get more negative than the resting membrane potential, that's called hyperpolarizing. So we'll use the term depolarizing, repolarizing, and hyperpolarizing relative to the membrane potential. Okay, now, we've been talking thus far mostly about leak channels. Leak channels are open all the time. You have a certain leak permeability for potassium, certain leak permeability for sodium and chloride. We're going to introduce another kind of channel, which is called a voltage-gated channel. And here you see voltage-gated channels for sodium and potassium. A voltage-gated sodium channel has three states that it can live in. It can be closed, it can open with a depolarizing stimulus so that sodium ions can go through, and it can become inactivated. Notice that it's not closed. Notice that the pore is still open, but ions can't go through because this inactivation gate. And it's been symbolized by this little ball and chain. People try to do X-ray diffraction or crystallography of these proteins and then X-ray diffraction and try to figure out what the heck these things are shaped. And it seems like there's this little ball and chain thing that inactivates the channel. But it's also a model that we use. This state's called inactivated. In order to close the channel, you have to repolarize it, and you need a certain amount of time. And then it resets, and it gets to the point where it could be opened again. Now here's our potassium channel. It can be closed, or it can be opened. We don't have the inactivation behavior that we associate with the sodium channel. We also talk about the sodium channel as being fast. It opens fast, it inactivates quickly. Potassium channels are slow. Takes time to open, takes time to close. So we use our knowledge of these channels to figure out what happens not during a passive current, but during an action potential. So we start out at a resting membrane potential of -70. We get a depolarizing stimulus that's a large enough stimulus to get us to something called threshold. Threshold is at a point that will open up a sodium channel. So notice the sodium channel goes from closed to open. And when the sodium channels are open, they allow sodium to come inside the cell. And as sodium comes in, the cell gets more depolarized. And more sodium comes in and more depolarized. And more sodium comes in and more depolarized till we reach this peak of the action potential. And what happens at this peak is that the sodium channels inactivate such that no more sodium can come in and the permeability plummets. Now at the same time, we open up a second channel, or the potassium channel. So we don't depolarize anymore, and now the potassium channels allow the membrane potential to come down. So a depolarizing stimulus opens up a potassium channel, and now we return to a more negative stimulus. And the membrane actually hyperpolarizes. That's called the after hyperpolarization. It gets more negative than rest, and then finally comes back, and why is that? Because we still have potassium channels that are open. And then it finally, as this potassium channel is closed, then the membrane potential gets back to rest. You can see the currents going along with this activity. Now these are what are called relative permeability traces, and relative permeability means, relatively speaking, how many of one kind of channel is open. So notice, as the action potential goes through its fast depolarization phase, what's happening? Sodium permeability increases. When the channels inactivate, we reach a peak of sodium permeability, and then it decreases very rapidly back to hardly anything. So we have depolarization, inactivation, and a decrease in permeability. With the same depolarizing stimulus, we get the opening of potassium channels, but because they're slower, we see their effects later. So potassium channels slowly open. We're not seeing much in the way of in the action potential until the sodium channels inactivate. And when the sodium channels inactivate, we see the effects of the potassium current. The potassium is allowing the membrane potential to repolarize. And because they're slow to close, the membrane potential actually does an after hyperpolarization, becomes more negative than rest. And as the potassium channels close, we return to a resting value. So, on the first day of class, I gave you a handout, and I gave an example of a positive and a negative feedback, and we didn't quite get to this in class. However, we can get to it now. The fast depolarizing phase of the membrane potential is like a positive feedback mechanism, because you have a depolarizing stimulus, the threshold depolarization, which causes the opening of voltage-gated channels, which causes an increased permeability, which causes increased sodium into the cell, which causes depolarization, which opens more channels, which increases the permeability, which gives you more sodium flow, which causes you more depolarization. So the definition of a positive feedback mechanism is one in which the response reinforces the original stimulus. Depolarization leads to more depolarization. And then there's an event that sort of stops the feedback. And that event is the inactivation. Now, the repolarizing phase of the action potential is a negative feedback mechanism because, again, the original stimulus was a depolarization. The depolarization by sodium coming in opens the voltage-gated potassium channels. And as you open potassium channels and increase potassium permeability, potassium flows out of the cell and causes repolarization. So depolarization leads in a repolarization response. So my response opposes the original stimulus, meaning that potassium channels participate in a negative feedback mechanism. Now, action potentials, we've already seen one way in which action potentials are very different than local current flow. Local current flow doesn't need a particular threshold. An action potential does. Local current flow is relying mostly on leak channels. Action potentials need voltage-gated channels. Local current flow can be varied in size. They're graded potentials. However, action potentials obey something called the law of all or none. So I've got a stimulus right here. But that stimulus was subthreshold. I get no behavior. Subthreshold, subthreshold. These are graded potentials that have decayed. Then I get a potential that reaches threshold. And now I get a full action potential. And I can stimulate again with a bigger stimulus, but notice my action potentials don't increase in size. So action potentials are, you get a very stereotypical behavior where you open up your voltage-gated sodium channels, then you open your voltage-gated potassium channels, and you get a very repeatable stereotypical behavior. Now, we also have something called refractory periods. Refractory is a word that means not responsive. If I've got pneumonia and I'm not getting better, and my doctor gives me some antibiotics and I still don't get better, my pneumonia is refractory to those particular antibiotics, and then maybe they have to try a different kind of antibiotic. So when a neuron is refractory, it means even though you're stimulating it, it's not responding. And there are two kinds of refractory periods. There's a relative refractory period. In the relative refractory period, if you stimulate the neuron enough, it will generate an action potential. It might not be a full action potential, but you'll get one. The absolute refractory period, it doesn't matter how much you stimulate the neuron. It doesn't matter how big the stimulus is. No matter what, the neuron will not generate an action potential. So in the first case, the neuron is relatively refractory. it doesn't respond to a typical stimulus, but if you give it a bigger stimulus, it will. Absolute refractory, it doesn't matter what, it doesn't matter what the size of the stimulus is, you won't get the action potential. So I wonder if I would be able to show this. So we get to the MetaNeura program, and you can see some things here. And I've got to download this and show you all these things. Actually, here's the refractory period portion where I stimulate a neuron and I get an action potential, and I've waited a good 5 milliseconds, and you stimulate again and you get a second action potential. Now, this shows me that I'm beyond the refractory period. However, I might get to maybe 4 milliseconds and I have to put in a bigger stimulus to get an action potential. I'd be relatively refractory. Maybe at 2 milliseconds, I try to stimulate and I put in, 1,000 microamps of current, and no matter what I do, I don't get an action potential. I'd be relatively refractory. And I believe I have a presentation that shows you this, that you can get in another site on the web. But let's go back to this picture right here, and oops, that's not what I meant to do. Okay, I wanted to see if I could erase. Oh, there I can. All right. So hopefully you can see my pointer. Once my voltage-gated sodium channels open and they inactivate, no matter what I do, I cannot stimulate a new action potential. So when a neuron is absolutely refractory, it's because the sodium channels are already open or they're inactivated, and the cell is not capable of responding. However, out here in this area, this is my relative refractory period. Notice my potassium channels are open. When I try to stimulate here, I'm not starting from rest. I'm starting from a hyperpolarized state. So I need more current to get to threshold. Do you see how I'm farther away from threshold? I need more current to get to threshold. So I can get an action potential, but I have to stimulate more to get to threshold. Once I get back to rest, my refractory period is over. So look on the website and see, I have another little video presentation that shows you using MetaNeuron how that works. All right. Now another thing here is that action potentials don't just stay put. They propagate. They go places. Let's see if I can get my pen back. All right. So they propagate. They're action potentials. They move actively. So here's where our action potential starts. There's the trigger zone. You get a threshold level stimulus. You open up your voltage-gated sodium channels. Sodium current goes in, and it's going to travel down the axon. This is already depolarized. That's going to repel positive current. Positive current is going to go to where it's negative. Then you bring this area of membrane to threshold, and then you have the action potential in this next segment. Because this area is still refractory, you can't get another action potential until the refractory period is over. So this allows current to go down I'm starting in the wrong place, go down the axon. So you let's go back to my laser pointer here. So so you depolarize this area, current goes down the axon, you bring the next membrane to threshold, you get an action potential here, current goes down the axon, you bring this area to threshold. So each patch of membrane is brought to threshold, and you're essentially recreating the action potential at each new segment. The action potential must go forward because these are the channels that can be activated. The action potential cannot go backwards because these channels are refractory. Now, there's a little difference in terms of clinical application. You could have a patient, perhaps they're doing surgery on the patient, and they want to see if the axons have been damaged. You could stimulate at the peripheral end of the axon and see if the current goes backwards. If you stimulate down here, the action potential should travel in the opposite direction. That's something that can be used clinically to see if neurons are functioning properly and to make sure they haven't been damaged as a result of a surgical procedure. Now, some axons are myelinated, some are not. The myelin comes from a type of cell, a glial cell. In the central nervous system, they're called oligodendrites, and in the peripheral nervous system, they're called neurolemmacytes or Schwann cells, and they're essentially cells that wrap layers and layers and layers of membrane around the axon and highly, highly insulate them. As a result, the action potential is going to occur at these nodes. At the places where you have this high level of insulation, current travels by local current flow. But because it's so well insulated, the current doesn't decay very much. So you're still at threshold when you get to this next node. And that's shown in this diagram here. You have all these voltage-gated channels in your node of Ranvier. You have an action potential. Local current flow takes you to the next node where you have another action potential. Local current flow takes you to the next node. So there's no action potential here. This is local current flow, but because the axon is so well insulated, you're still at threshold when you reach this next node. Now, this is called saltatory conduction, which comes from a French word called to jump. It drives me crazy. I think it's a terrible name because there's no jumping going on. You may have been taught there's an action potential here and it jumps to the next node. That's complete horse hockey. You have an action potential and then local current flow. Action potential, local current flow. And because you're only having action potentials at the nodes, this makes this type of propagation really, really fast. Now, what can happen is the myelin sheath can be destroyed. And then what happens is that you have a bunch of leaking going on. So that instead of having an action potential and fast current flow, action potential, fast current flow, you have current leaking out of your damaged myelin. And so when you get to subsequent nodes of Ranvier, you might not be at threshold, and the action potential then can't travel all the way down the axon. And that can result in muscle weakness. And as I show you, MS and Guillain-Barré are a couple of examples of demyelinating diseases. Guillain-Barré is associated with some vaccines. I think when you get your flu vaccine, they'll ask you if anyone in your family's had Guillain-Barré. Guillain-Barré is demyelination of the peripheral nervous system, so that ends up in muscle weakness. MS is demyelination of the entire nervous system. So if you demyelinate inhibitory neurons, you can actually get some overactivity and spasticity. So you have very variable symptoms depending on which kind of neurons are being demyelinated. And and there's an ebb and flow to that kind of disease where you have myelin being lost and replaced and lost, and it's a very, very complex disease. All right, now clinical application. If your voltage-gated sodium channels are blocked with a drug called lidocaine, or a class of drug that block voltage-gated sodium channels, they're called local anesthetics, you're going to block the action potential, but you might not get full anesthesia, or full analgesia is what I really want to say. So we can think about that. Let's go back to this picture. Okay, let's say you give some drug and you block up these sodium channels and you block up these sodium channels. So you get a depolarizing stimulus here, and you have local current flow that maybe flows past a couple of nodes, and it gets here, and it's decayed some, but it's still at threshold. Then your action potential will start here, and the person will feel pain. This can happen at the dentist. So they give you a shot of Novocaine, they start drilling, and you can still feel it. What it means is that the drilling is exciting pain receptors. You're getting local depolarization. You're getting local current flow. And if it's able to get past the area of local anesthetic, you'll feel pain. So you give them another shot, and you probably give them another shot a little farther away, so you've increased the area of analgesia. Other thing they'll do, speaking of dentists, is they put epinephrine in their Novocaine, in their local anesthetic. And the reason why they do that is epinephrine will constrict the blood vessels and keep the Novocaine in the area being drilled and not have it escape and have peripheral effects, though that still can happen to people. All right, so here's another set of learning objectives. What are the events that lead to an action potential? What kind of events occur during the action potential, and what are the channels involved? How is local current spread different than an action potential? And where are you finding the local current versus the action potential? You know, in general, local current is happening at the dendrites in the cell body. The action potential is happening along the axon. I need you to understand the difference between absolute and relative refractory periods and those channels involved, what myelin does to the speed of action potential conduction, and how demyelinating diseases can interfere with that. I think what I'm going to do is end this presentation, and the next part is synaptic transmission, and I think I'm going to make a new presentation for that one. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you're enjoying your studying. If you have questions, I hope you put them on the website, or you email me, or bring them to class, and I look forward to seeing you next time.